When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Judeans who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. Jesus said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Judeans said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not the one who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, there is already a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "God, I thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When Jesus had said this, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." The Gospel of Jesus Christ. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. I probably say this every year, but All Saints Sunday is one of my favorite days on the church calendar. On this day, we not only give thanks for the life and witness of all the saints, past and present, who help us experience the love of God, but we also intentionally make space for the grief that surrounds the loss of those saints in our lives, especially those who have died in the past year. Some have called this day an annual funeral for all whom we have lost, a time we deliberately stand in that space where grief and glory intermix, sitting together between tears and triumph. And the very intentionality of this day stands at such odds with the way the culture that surround us operates, right? I'm not sure when it happened, but at some point we as a society decided that it's really not okay to grieve. At some point we as a society decided that we don't really want to talk about death at all. Sure, some grief is okay. Some lament when a loved one dies is understandable. But after a certain point, like after the funeral is done, you should probably get over that. We try to bottle up and hide these painful times in our lives, the struggles we are going through, as if pain was so neat, as if grief was so linear, as if hiding our struggles magically make them disappear, as if never talking about death somehow defangs its power. And so many of us who grew up identifying as male have experienced one of the more insidious lies of patriarchy, that we need to hide our emotions. I mean, I'm confident that my parents never told me this, but somehow this society drilled into my head from a very young age that real men don't cry. And yet, I'm not ashamed to admit that I found myself unexpectedly crying recently, and I don't just mean during the music this morning. As I was scrolling through my social media feed recently, I watched a clip of an interview with the actor Andrew Garfield. You may have even heard of the interviewer. His name is Elmo. You see, Andrew's mother died a few years ago, and when he recently appeared on Sesame Street, Elmo asked him how he was doing. Well, in that clip, Andrew says that he's a little sad because he's missing his mom. Elmo immediately says he's sorry, but Andrew replies, "You don't have to say you're sorry. It's actually kind of okay to miss somebody. Sadness, it's a kind of gift. It's kind of lovely thing to feel in a way because it means that you really loved somebody if you missed them." I didn't expect to be in tears watching that clip. I also didn't expect to see a crying Andrew Garfield give Elmo a hug. But I'm so thankful for this reminder and this lesson to our children that we shouldn't be ashamed of our grief, that it can be a reminder of the magnitude of our love for somebody. And I do hope that this message makes an impact in our society, that it's okay to talk about our pains, it's okay to talk about our grieving, it's okay to talk about our struggles. That is okay not to talk at all, because sometimes we can just sit in that sadness with someone as well. That our tears are not a sign of weakness, they're testaments of our love. That we are saying how important this person was and is to us, even if they've been gone for years. And it's okay to admit that someday we too will die. Because as much as we try to escape it, to trick ourselves into thinking that we can avoid its sting, death is the great equalizer. The prophet Isaiah calls death the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet that is spread over all nations. There is no person on this planet, no nation on earth that is immune from death. It does not regard social status, age, sex, or wealth. This day, especially this feast day, honestly tells us that one day death will come for us all. And at some point, we will all experience, if we haven't already, its piercing pain through the departure of a loved one. When we do feel that sting, perhaps we feel a kinship with Mary as she threw herself at Jesus' feet and berated him for not being there. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Where were you, Jesus? Where are you, Jesus? How could you let this happen? Mary weeps at Jesus' feet. Her community weeps around them. And then Jesus himself begins to weep. If we needed any better teacher than Elmo to tell us that it's okay to be sad, we see God incarnate cry with a grieving family. If we needed any more contrast to our society's avoidance of grief, any stronger rejection of toxic masculinity, we see Christ Jesus openly cry at Lazarus' tomb because of his great love for him. We see that not only are our tears valid, they are holy because they proclaim our love. And not only does God see our grief, God stands with us in the pain and the hurt and grieves with us. Our God weeps with us. Perhaps the raw honesty of this day might allow us to be more open about the other tears that we have been shedding, the other griefs that we are carrying, the sicknesses in our bodies and in our families, the end of relationships, the loss of jobs, the life that has turned out differently than we had hoped. I think it's part of the human experience to hold these various griefs together within us, the love and the loss and the in-between, even as we just try to make it through another day. Sometimes it feels like that's all we can do, especially when we avoid talking about our feelings. This week, perhaps we are all even sharing a collective, maybe even an anticipatory grief, the pain of a divided country, the trauma of what we've lived through, the anxiety of what may happen in the days and weeks to come. We know that this week especially may be brimming with tears regardless of who is declared to be our next president. We can recognize that we come here this morning carrying all sorts of burdens and apprehensions and pains, maybe even those known only to us. We can support each other in our pains, sit with each other through our tears, and look for Christ's presence among us this morning, during this week, throughout these lives marred by all sorts of grief. But if this day is in some ways a funeral, that means that it is also the time that we intentionally try to trust that our grief will not last forever. Because while God is standing with us in our pains, while God is weeping with us, God is not bound by grief. That Jesus, just as Jesus brought Lazarus out of the tomb, God is working within and among us to destroy that shroud the prophet spoke of. that just as Christ refused to be bound by the ills of this world, he is walking with us from the sorrows of the cross into the joy of the resurrection dawn. That even now, God is preparing a feast. This is not some ordinary meal or even a funeral potluck. This is the feast of rich foods and well-aged wines that God is preparing for all people on that mountain. And as we are feasting on that heavenly spread, God will be dismantling death itself so it will no longer have power over us, and our tears on all our faces will be wiped away. St. John the Revelator gives us another vision of that yet more glorious day when death will no longer have dominion over God's good creation. See, the home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with them as their God. They will be God's people, and that very God will be with them. God will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. It's almost impossible for us to imagine the complete end of all our pains and suffering, but ours is a God who keeps those promises. Ours is a God of might who is using that might to transform what is into what will be. Ours is a God who stands with us in the face of death, who stands with us in our grief, who stands with us no matter what the future may bring, and is yet ever working toward that day when grief will give way to glory, when our tears will transform into triumph, because death will no longer have the final word. Ours is a God who will take the worst things this world can offer and will use them to create wholeness and new life. Part of the beautiful mystery of this day is that Christ, who himself experienced the pain of grief, the pain of death itself, is here with us to show us how to experience resurrection. That we need not wait for that promised day to live in the new life Christ is preparing, because he has opened up to us all. A world where all people know that they are beloved by God, already proclaimed as holy saints. A life rooted in love where hatred and fear have no power. A welcome table that is set for all, where food and drink is shared by all. A hope that Jesus himself embodied when, cheeks still stained with tears, he called his beloved friend to come out of the tomb, back from death, and into his embrace again. We dare to put our faith, our hope, our trust in the one who has triumphed over death forever, who has brought his beloved friend into the fullness of this new life, and who has promised us an everlasting place there too. See, Jesus says to us again today, I am making all things new. In just a few minutes, we will gather around this table to share a foretaste of that great feast to come. And as we come, we will pass by these photos and candles of all the saints who have gone before us. We will pass this font that binds us together with all the saints of all time and space. At this table, we may cry, grieving our loved ones and the holes that they have left in our lives, confident that Christ is here grieving and crying with us too. At this table, we do give thanks, celebrating the love, the memories, the way these saints have impacted our lives, confident that they continue to love and pray for us. At this table, we are united with the entire communion of saints, past, present, and future, in experiencing, anticipating, and participating in the new and everlasting life that Christ has promised for each of us. At this table, we see the vision Isaiah foretold of a feast that is prepared for all people, and we are filled with Christ's own self to help us make that vision a reality. We proclaim our hope in that day when our faith shall be sight, whether in this life or the next, as we enter into the new heaven and the new earth with tears running down our cheeks, no longer tears of grief and sorrow, but tears of triumph and ineffable joy, because at last the enemy of all of us has been defeated, and God's own love and joy and life will reign forever. See, this is our God. This is the compassionate one for whom we have waited. Let us rejoice and be glad in the salvation of God.